The church bells rang low across the dry western valley, their sound echoing through the stillness of the land, where cattle grazed far in the distance. And within the little chapel, every eye was fixed on the young bride standing at the altar, her hands trembling as she clutched the bouquet of faded white roses. She was dressed in the gown her mother had once worn, a gown patched and altered to hide its age, but it did nothing to hide her fear, for her tears were already streaming down her face as the preacher's voice carried on with the solemn words of the vows. The cowboy beside her, tall, broad-shouldered, and hardened by years of labor under the sun, looked at her not with impatience, but with a gentleness that surprised everyone who knew him. Folks in town often whispered about him, calling him cold, stubborn, too proud to bend to anyone. Yet there he stood, his brown hat removed in respect, his eyes softened by something only she could see. The bride's sobs grew heavier as she struggled to speak, her voice breaking when asked to promise love and loyalty, because the truth was, she had not come to this marriage with joy, but with a heart that had been torn apart before it even had the chance to dream. Her family had lost everything after her father's debts, and with no one else willing to take her, she had been promised to the cowboy, a man she barely knew, in exchange for a chance at survival. She had walked into that chapel believing her life was already over, that she would live beside a stranger with no warmth, no laughter, no spark of love to carry her through the lonely years ahead. But as her tears dropped onto the wilted roses, the cowboy leaned closer, his rough hand brushing against hers, steadying her shaking body, and in a voice low enough that only she could hear, he whispered, "I'll make you smile someday." Those words cut through the air like sunlight breaking a storm. She blinked through her tears, startled, and for the first time since she had stepped into the church, her sobbing quieted, because though his voice was steady, there was a tremor of sincerity, a promise not bound by duty, but by something deeper, something real. The preacher, unaware of the quiet exchange, continued with the ceremony, but the bride's heart began to beat differently now, as if hope had been planted in soil that had long gone dry. She looked up at him then, into his weathered face, the lines carved by years of hard work, and instead of coldness, she saw patience, a man willing to wait, to prove himself not with grand gestures, but with steady presence. The townsfolk shifted in their pews, some whispering about the bride's tears, others shaking their heads in disapproval. But none of them knew what had just passed between the two standing at the altar. When it came time for her to answer the vows, her lips quivered, her throat closed up, but with his hand pressing lightly against hers, she found the courage to nod, not because of the words spoken aloud, but because of the vow unspoken that he would not let her carry sorrow alone. The ceremony ended with polite clapping, the preacher blessing the union. But as the bride and cowboy turned to face the small gathering, she still carried traces of tears on her cheeks. Yet now, there was something else too, the faintest flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of her happiness but the beginning of a story she had not dared to imagine. Outside, the sun blazed across the open land, and the wind tugged at her veil, lifting it like wings ready to take flight, while the cowboy guided her gently down the steps, not with the pride of possession, but with the quiet strength of a man who had made a promise. In the distance, the ranch awaited, a lonely stretch of earth with weathered fences and wide skies, but in her heart, the echo of his words repeated, soft yet unshakable, "I'll make you smile someday." And as the wagon rolled away from the church, carrying them into a new life neither fully understood, she wiped the last of her tears and allowed herself the smallest, shyest smile, a fragile seed of hope planted in the harsh soil of reality, ready to grow under the care of a cowboy who had chosen not just to marry her, but to fight for her joy. This was only the beginning, and the road ahead would be filled with trials, storms, and reckonings. But in that moment, under the wide western sky, two broken hearts began to find their way toward healing. The wagon wheels rattled over the dusty trail as the cowboy guided his new bride home, the wide plains stretching endlessly around them, and though silence hung between them, it was not the heavy silence of despair she had feared, but a quieter, gentler one, as if both were carefully stepping into a life neither knew how to shape yet. When they reached the ranch, the bride looked upon the weathered fences, the creaking barn, and the lonely little house standing against the horizon, and though it was not grand or welcoming, it felt strangely honest. Like the man who had whispered to her at the altar, he carried her bags inside without asking for thanks, lit a lantern, and told her simply, "This is your home now." That night, she lay awake listening to the wind brushing against the wooden walls, tears still wetting her pillow, wondering if she could ever belong to this new life. And yet, she remembered his words, "I'll make you smile someday," and clung to them as though they were a lifeline. Days turned into weeks, and she discovered the cowboy was a man of few words. Yet his actions spoke louder than any promises. He fixed the broken shutters so she could sleep without the cold, night air cutting through. He brought her wildflowers from the field and left them on the table without a word. And when he worked long hours tending cattle, he returned each evening with the same steady presence, never demanding her affection, but never letting her feel forgotten. Slowly, she began to see that beneath his rugged exterior lived a man who had known loneliness just as deep as hers, a man who had built walls around his heart not out of pride, but out of fear of losing what little he had left. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of fire, he found her crying quietly by the corral, clutching the shawl around her shoulders, and instead of walking past as so many men might have, he sat beside her in the dirt, handed her his hat to shield her from the fading light, and said, "Don't ever think tears make you weak. They make you honest." For the first time, she looked at him not as a stranger, forced into her life, but as someone who might truly understand her pain. The seasons shifted, and as autumn winds swept across the land, she learned how to ride the ranch horses with his patient teaching, how to mend fences by his side, and how to laugh at first softly, then freely when he told her the clumsiest stories about his younger days. It wasn't grand romance that grew between them, but something steadier, deeper, a trust built day by day like bricks laid into a home's foundation. The townsfolk who once whispered about the weeping bride at the altar began to see her differently when she walked beside him in the market, her eyes brighter, her steps steadier, as though she had found her footing in a world she had once dreaded. But the true change came one winter night when a storm swept across the valley, and the roof began to leak, the wind howling through every crack. Frightened, she curled against him for warmth, and he held her close, murmuring against her hair, "I told you someday you'd smile, and now I'll make sure you never lose it." In that moment, she realized she had not only stopped crying, but had begun to dream again, to believe that love could grow even from sorrow. The tears she once shed at the vows no longer haunted her, for they had become the soil from which joy had bloomed. By spring, when wildflowers colored the valley and their ranch thrived with new life, she stood beside him at the same church where her story had begun, only this time not as the girl who wept, but as the woman who laughed softly as he whispered something playful just for her. The preacher smiled at them knowingly, and the congregation, who had once judged her tears, now saw the proof of his promise in the light dancing in her eyes. The cowboy had kept his word not through riches, not through grand gestures, but through patience, kindness, and unwavering devotion, and she, in turn, had learned to open her heart to the man who had chosen to heal instead of demand. And so their story did not end at the wedding vows where sorrow had begun, but in the countless little moments that followed, moments that built a life strong enough to weather storms and tender enough to cradle laughter. Under the wide, endless western sky, they lived not as strangers, bound by duty, but as two souls who had found love in the most unlikely place. And whenever anyone asked her about that tear-stained wedding day, she only smiled, leaned into her cowboy's steady arm, and said, "He promised me I'd smile someday." And he kept that promise every single day since. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, and share. Your support helps bring more powerful love stories to life for you.